And welcome. It's episode number 27 of The Rent Roll, your podcast on all things rental housing, SFR, BTR, and apartments. And today we'll be talking about the thing that I told you earlier this year has been the biggest surprise in this cycle. The one thing that I really missed on going into last year and so far even this year, because I doubled down on it. I said I thought we would see retention finally start to come down. Instead, it keeps coming up. February, we saw the highest retention rate in nearly 3 years for apartments. And we continue to hear from the SFR side, high retention as well. So I'll be diving into that. What is driving these high retention numbers, the low renter turnover? Why do renters continue to stay put at these high levels? Then I'll be diving into a semi-related topic, and that is the latest proptech buzz. And for that, I've got with me my friend Dom Beveridge, the founder and principal for 20 for 20, who is every year puts out this great report on proptech trends and really does it from a thought leadership perspective. You know, there's a lot of stuff in this world that tends to be very kind of marketing heavy and, you know, kind of direct, you know, overt salesy. But Dom just does a really good job cutting through the noise and talking about the trends that are not just the specific technologies, but the real trends of interest. And particularly, we're diving into the ones that are kind of institutional investment interest that can really drive improvement in NOI. Again, talking really themes more than particular companies. So stay with us for that conversation with Dom. All right, before we jump in, big shout out to our sponsors. Thank you to JPI, leading apartment developer in Texas, Southern California, and now moving elsewhere as well, and to Madera Residential, operating in Texas. So as always, we're going to kick it off with here's a chart. And I know many of you can't see the video, but I always try to walk you through it. And I'm thankful I can't see the video today, actually, because I just came back from spring break and managed to get a ski mask tan, or burn, I should say. I'm a fair-haired person, so I don't really tan, just burn, and got the kind of awkward ski mask burn from failing to put on enough sunscreen. So my father's not listening. He's always reminding me to put on more sunscreen. But I promise, Dad, it's not much of a burn, just a little bit of a reddish tint. I think I'm okay. Just looks a little funny. But anyway, we had a good time. Took the family skiing for the week, and now back at it. All right, so let's get into it. Here's some charts. Apartment resident retention hits its highest level in nearly 3 years. Okay, February, 56.3%. That's a high number. I mean, retention is a very seasonal number. It tends to be higher in the winter months. People tend not to move as much. But even when you look at this for a February, that's a high number. It's the second highest February on record outside of February 2022, when inflation was at its peak. But it's not even just about this month or even these last 12 months. It's not about the period in which mortgage rates have shot up. And everybody always wants to talk about, high retentions because people aren't moving out as much. It's not just about that. It's not correlated just with that. We have seen structurally higher retention, lower turnover throughout these last 5+ years since COVID hit. Now, 5+ years since COVID hit. So pre-COVID, we hovered between 49 and 54% for the most part on the percentage of apartment renters renewing their leases for market rate apartments. Since COVID, we've been in the 52 to 58% range. The average retention rate has been about 300 bips higher this decade so far than it was in the last half of the 2010s decade. And that's a material difference. And that's what makes this especially surprising. And the reason I mentioned that I really missed on this, kind of the one thing I particularly missed on in my outlook for this going into last year, is that we're in the midst of the biggest supply wave for apartments in 40 or 50 years. So renters today have a lot more options. And by the way, many are moving up. You know, we see the filtering effect playing out where particularly the well-off renters and more affordable properties are moving up market as availability has come online. The A- the A+ properties, the B renter moving to the A-, the more affluent Class C renters moving up to the Bs. So that filtering phenomenon really is playing out. There's plenty of evidence for that, but we also see a lot of people choosing to stay put, more people choosing to stay put than previously, and really any point that we have in recent history. So that's really the story. And it's a similar story when we look at single family rentals. My friends at John Burns Research and Consulting, they put out they combine a weighted average of the publicly traded REITs. Of course, now we're down to two of them, but the trend line is very similar. Of course, and if those of you can see the screen, it's showing turnover instead of retention, just inverse of the same stat, but it's the same idea where we are seeing just structurally lower turnover in this environment. By the way, what's interesting is it's not just when mortgage rates shot up and home prices stayed sticky and people stopped moving to buy homes, all that kind of stuff. Even when home sales were booming early on in this decade, back in 21 and 22 and even in 2020, we saw lower turnover than we saw in the second half of the 2010s decade. And so it's not just about home purchases, a lack of home purchases. And I think, that's something I continue to try to tell people. I think everybody just wants to make it about that one thing. And it's clearly not, because again, this trend started when COVID hit, when people couldn't move because of the pandemic, and then it stayed low as mobility started to pick back up again, and now it's getting lower again, with obviously home purchase being more challenging due to today's rates. All right, back to apartments. We have, I wish we had more data on SFR, but unfortunately that data is pretty limited still today, but we do get a lot more granular data on apartments. So let's look at this at retention by property age. This data is from RealPage, looking at lease transactional retention trends by the age of the property. In every vintage, retention is much higher than it was pre-COVID. For most vintages, retention today even exceeds the post-COVID average of these last 5 years. So even properties built just this decade, since 2020, these newest properties, they almost always tend to see higher turnover as, lease up concessions burn off, renters chase the next deal, concession hoppers, as I call them. But even in this group of new properties, retention today is more than 200 bips above the average over these past 5 years. So more supply and yet higher retention. That's not the pattern that's supposed to play out. It's not what we expect to see. And yet that is what's happening. And it's a similar trend in older properties. This is maybe less surprising, but we continue to see renters move up from older properties and newer properties as new properties come online. That's the filtering phenomenon playing out in real time. Plenty of evidence for that, as I mentioned earlier. And yet even more renters choosing to stay put and renew their leases. Same story, we look at properties by asset class, A, B, or C. Retention is usually higher in the more affordable Class C. That continues to be true, even as, again, some move up market. But even in Class A, retention rates have climbed up despite all that new supply competition. All right, now let's look at this by metro area for the top 50 MSAs. And I'll give you a few observations here for those of you who can see the chart. It's a scatter plot showing retention rates over these last 12 months on average compared to the pre-COVID average. And we still see the slower growth, low supply markets with the highest retention rates, as we almost always do. Faster growth markets across the Sun Belt and mountain regions, they tend to be more transient, more mobile, therefore more turnover, even in a low supply environment. And so we still see retention rates. So where the retention rates are highest, it's still the usual suspects. It's the slower growth markets across the Midwest and the Northeast. A bunch of those are north of 60%. And by the way, almost all of those are above pre-COVID norms too. In fact, of these top 50 markets, all but 6 are topping our pre-COVID norms. So it's not just the Midwest, Northeast, the low supply markets, it's everywhere. The only ones that are not above pre-COVID norms, there's 3 of them are just basically at that line, less than 50 bips below. That's Austin, Dallas, and Milwaukee, less than 50, again, less than half a percentage point below normal in each one, below pre-COVID normal, I should say. Austin, Texas, not surprisingly, has the lowest retention rate in the country, also the fastest supply growth market in the country, but that was pretty much true pre-COVID as well. It's just ahead of Denver and Salt Lake City. Those are the bottom 3 markets from the country for retention, all less than 50% of renters renewing leases. But they, again, all tended to be low retention, high turnover markets even prior to COVID. So nothing really unusual there. Where we really do, there's 3 spots we really do see retention rates below pre-COVID levels. Los Angeles, 2 percentage points below normal. Oakland, about 4 percentage points. And the real oddball here is Miami. about 8 percentage points below normal. And by the way, it's not the same thing in Fort Lauderdale, Broward County, and in Palm Beach County. It's Miami-Dade where that's happening. And for the record, I looked into this a little bit. Other Miami stats are pretty much in line or better than the U.S. averages right now. So it's not clear why turnover in Miami is so much higher than it was pre-COVID. The average, by the way, retention rate in Miami is still roughly in line with the U.S. average. So it's not especially low. It's just dropped off a lot from where it was prior to COVID. But nothing in the data suggests any kind of doomsday scenario right now there by any means. And even across the rest of Florida, we don't see that pattern playing out. It's generally still above pre-COVID levels in the rest of Florida. But also just a broader comment, not just in Florida, but across the Sun Belt and the mountain markets where the high supply is coming. All of them, for the most part, again, with the exception of the couple I mentioned earlier, are seeing above average retention despite these multi-decade highs in supply. I mean, places like Nashville, Charlotte, Raleigh, most of Florida, most of Texas are all above pre-COVID norms on retention, as well as I mentioned the Midwest and Northeast, but also most of the West Coast outside of LA and Oakland. So it's a pretty remarkable trend here. Again, when you look at this kind of shift in the comparison of pre-COVID retention rates versus current, it's not really correlated with supply. It's not correlated with rents or other measures of affordability. It's not correlated to home prices or jobs. It's pretty consistent across the board. It's the same general pattern in terms of rankings among markets. It's just that for the most part, everywhere is just seeing higher retention. Usual suspects leading, usual suspects trailing, but the same overall trend happening across the country. Now, one explanation for why retention is so high across the country could be slower rent increases. That's the first thing you might want to look at is, okay, people are just getting a better deal to stay put. And it really does not look that simple. On the one hand, yes, renewal rent increases have cooled way down from where they were at the peak of inflation a couple of years ago. At one point, we had the average renewal increase was around 10%, which was obviously the highest on record. And that was when everything was just peaking on, high inflation across, most categories of the consumer price index. In February of 2025, though, it was back to 3.68%. That was lower than pre-COVID, but even pre-COVID, we were kind of low fours, and 2019 was 4.28%. So for an average apartment lease, when you look at 3.68% versus 4.28%, that's a difference of $10 or $11 a month. And for most market rate apartment renters, $10 or $11 a month is not going to really move the needle dramatically on whether you choose to renew your lease or move elsewhere. And so I don't think renewal rent increases are really the main driver. I think they're contributing. Obviously, when you see a renewal offer that's now in 3 to 4% range, so the upper single digits, I think that makes it more digestible, less likely you're going to shop around. But it doesn't explain the whole story here. By the way, one other comment is on renewal rent increases. They're pretty consistent across all property ages and property classes, all between 3.5% to 4.5%. All right, here's another big one we talk about a lot. I alluded to this earlier, the lack of move-outs to home purchase. Everyone talks about this all the time, how much more expensive it is to buy versus rent right now. The premium to buy versus rent an apartment is now $1,600 a month in terms of your all-in costs. You'll pay $1,600 a month more to be a new buyer versus renter. And again, this is not for current owners. It's for those entering the home ownership market. For SFR renters, it's about $1,000 a month difference. Pre-COVID, it was about $600 premium for apartment renters and close to break even for SFR renters. So obviously this is a factor. Every REIT's talked about record low move-outs to home purchase, both SFR and apartments, but I don't think it's the only factor. Remember, as I mentioned earlier, retention has been high this entire cycle since COVID, even when home sales were booming for a couple of years there. So while low move-outs to purchase may explain some of the incremental difference between today's retention rate and the average of these last 5 years, it really doesn't explain why we've just structurally been so much higher in this cycle than we were pre-COVID. I do think a couple of factors play a role as well. One, I'm reluctant to even mention because I don't want to make too big of and I don't want to come across like a cheerleader for this, because believe it or not, I'm not really a prop tech apologist these days, but I do think prop tech deserves some credit here. The technology today for the resident experience and for the renewal process is just so much better than it was pre-COVID. Far more advanced resident portals where residents can do all the things they used to have to go into a leasing office to do, or have to make a phone call to do and be on hold for a while. Gamification tools that accelerated over these last few years, like the one my friend John Hinckley created with Modern Message, now others as well, and other tools that pair rent payments with various types of rewards. We've got a lot more focus today on reputation scores and net promoter scores through tools like Aura, online reputation assessment. And the renewal process is much less frictional as well. It used to be property managers put a renewal packet on your door or under your door, and today you get a text message or an email. You can renew your lease in a couple of clicks. And it's not just the Class A properties anymore. It's happening almost across the board, at least in the professional managed world. And so I think less friction certainly encourages less shopping around. When all else be equal, particularly if the renewal rent increase is in the lower single digits, less friction is probably going to encourage people just to go down the easier path of renewing. And now, of course, also more AI tools, sometimes even specialized, centralized renewal team members, making that process further, even additionally less frictional. And I'll talk a little about that with Dom Beveridge later on. We talk about some of the prop tech stuff. And second, very related theme, I think, is across the industry, this intensified focus on retention. And people kind of scoff when you mention this sometimes, but when you try to do something better, you put enough focus on it. If you do it right, it really should pay off. And I think this is something that those outside the industry just can't fully grasp. Sometimes I talk about this with reporters and others, and it doesn't seem to get fully appreciated. If you're not at industry conferences or listening to these webinars or talking to property managers, you just can't fully understand how intense the focus has been these last few years on protecting the back door, heads on beds, back to the basics of customer service, or even going back as far as the COVID era, which I think really started over having to figure out how do we serve these residents? We can't really see them on a daily basis. I think that was a real pivot point in the industry. And then, of course, nearly everyone's talking about these similar things. We hear it on the REIT calls all the time. They're talking about high retention rates. They're boasting about what they did to get there. In the private side, they're talking about the same things. And now we have more metrics to gauge it as well. Property managers can now rely on these NPS scores and Aura scores. And, some people kind of just are a little bit cynical about scores. But, the reality is, if the score is done correctly and objectively, if you focus on it and if you're doing it right, you're going to end up improving the experience for your residents, which in turn should manifest into higher retention. And it is. That appears to be happening. So I think it's one of several factors that's playing into this higher retention we're seeing in this cycle. And again, given the higher vacancy today, given the 40, 50-year highs in new supply, given the increased number of options that renters have in the market, that is a real achievement, and credit to property managers out there who are really putting a focus on retention. Now, one last factor, or possible factor, and really a theory I'll share on this topic before I move on. And I don't have a lot of great data on it, but I do have a little bit. That is the relationship between consumer confidence and retention. So when you overlay retention rates with consumer confidence as measured from University of Michigan's Consumer Confidence Index, you can see there's been an inverse relationship. Now, is this correlation or causation? I don't know for sure, but I can't help but wonder if there isn't something here. Think about just human nature. When we feel less confident, more unsure, more uncertain, what is human nature to do? It's to do nothing, because uncertainty has a freezing effect. When we're uncertain, we're probably less likely to go make a major decision like buying a house or moving to sign a new lease somewhere else. The exception seems to be young adults who are coming out of school or getting or leaving their parents' nest for the first time. I've mentioned this before, but the share of young adults living at home has gone down these last few years. So those factors could explain why we've seen a lot of new lease demand for apartments, especially in this last year or so. But on the renewal side, people still have jobs and are financially okay. They're still paying the rent, but maybe their perception of the economy or fear of potential slowdown, maybe that's influencing their behavior to some degree. And we did see consumer confidence drop down fairly substantially in February. And so does that play some role? Maybe. I don't think it's a factor for every renter. I think that a lot of other factors talked about play a role too. But even though it's a factor for 4 or 5% of renters, that amounts to a huge number, a nominal number of people, and certainly more than enough to move the needle on retention. So bottom line to me is I don't think it's any one factor that's leading this record high retention that we've seen in this cycle, but I do think it's a combination of these things. The big jump to buy versus rent, the financial factor there, the intense focus across the industry on retention, on heads and beds, the proptech innovations that really simplify the renewal experience, remove a lot of the friction associated with it, and then again maybe lower consumer confidence and the nervousness about potential relocations plays a role as well. So we'll see how this continues to play out, but it appears to be that we're just going to maybe see a new normal of higher structural retention. All right, next up, rental housing trivia. All right, today's question relates to our theme around retention. Which market does not rank in the top 10 for highest apartment resident retention rates over the last year? I'll give you 5 choices here: Chicago, Cleveland, Detroit, Milwaukee, or New York. All right, so it's one of those 5 is not in the top 10 for highest retention rates. In fact, all of these are above 60% retention except for one. So give it a guess and we'll give you the answer in a bit. But first up, in the news. All right, in the news, when we review some headlines of the week that touch on rental housing, so I'm going to give you 3 different headlines here. The first one comes from the Wall Street Journal. It says, Trump wants to build homes on federal land. Here's what that would look like. Developing federal land could produce a surge in new housing, but it faces some of the same obstacles builders encounter. All right, so let me read a little bit of from this article. This is actually probably the best article I've seen on this topic. A couple of great stats. I'm kind of reading this verbatim for a little bit. Developing even 512,000 acres of the Bureau of Land Management's lots could yield between 3 million and 4 million new homes across western states such as Nevada, Utah, California, and Arizona, according to a preliminary analysis by the American Enterprise Institute. And later on it says about 47 million acres, or 7.3% of all federal land, falls within metropolitan areas that need more homes, according to a Wall Street Journal analysis of government land maps and housing shortage data from the National Association of Realtors. All right, so that's a couple stats from the article. Now, I've been skeptical that any plan to repurpose federal lands could yield much housing at all, but this Wall Street Journal article actually makes me more optimistic. Now, of course, I should point out that obviously not all land is suitable for housing. Some is already in use, others is in locations that's far too desolate for construction and for housing, but this data shows us that the impact could still be significant. Obviously, the federal government's a massive landowner, so even a small share of it can move the needle. And seeing that, what was that number? 7.3% is located within MSAs that are actually experiencing a housing shortage. That's 47 million acres is a lot of land. So the article goes on to talk about that the secretaries of HUD and Interior are partnering together on a project to identify federal land suitable for housing, then fast-track development. There'll be an emphasis on affordable housing. So again, I don't think this will be a one-stop shop panacea to the housing shortage in America, but it could be a real needle mover. Of course, the wild card, as the article talks about, is if cities and NIMBY voters don't get in the way. But hopefully, we prioritize working with cities that actually want more housing instead of wanting to exacerbate the crisis and point fingers elsewhere. And also, one other thing I'll point out. Jenny Schutz, she's a great follow if you don't follow her on social media. She tweeted half jokingly that we could build housing on the surface parking lots of the Pentagon and other places like that, prime real estate. And it's a good reminder that not all federal lands are barren deserts for military testing or pristine natural wonders and natural national parks. We can get creative. And replacing some well-located surface parking lots with some garages and some housing is a creative solution in some situations. All right, next headline comes from Yahoo Finance. Housing starts rebound in February. All right, so obviously it's not just Yahoo Finance, but everybody picks up on this number when it comes out each month, those housing starts numbers. And it brings up a pet peeve of mine. I've not really talked about this very much on these podcasts. I'm going to bring it up here. When you see headlines on housing starts, it's based on one tab in the census data file called seasonally adjusted. It's annualized seasonally adjusted number based on a very complicated methodology, and it creates a ton of volatility in the data, especially in multifamily, up, down, the zigzag chart. So any month doesn't really tell you anything except that it's a volatile data set. If you look at these last 15 months in the seasonally adjusted multifamily data, it's been up 7 times from the previous month. It's been down 8 times from the previous month, up and down, up and down. So that creates a misleading story. The February 2025 data shows multifamily starts at 370,000 units, which is one of the highest numbers in these last 12 months. And that's very misleading. So I think when we look at housing starts, I think a better source is some of the private data collectors. But if you do use census data, I would look at the non-seasonally adjusted trailing 12-month data. In that data set, it's been down 13 of the last 14 months and 21 of the last 24 months. That is a much, much, much more accurate picture of what's actually happening. Multifamily starts continue to fall. And again, on a non-seasonally adjusted basis, multifamily starts in the last 12 months totaled 330,100 units, which was the lowest since July of 2014. And that better matches what we see in the private sector data sets, and it's more reflective of what's actually happening right now. And that's what headlines and policy wonks should be focusing on. All right, next headline. It comes out of WHYY, a PBS and NPR affiliate in, I believe, the Philadelphia area. It says, West Oak Lane tenants say their landlord illegally collected rent for months. Now they're suing. The class action complaint calls on the property owner to make the property safe and repay tenants who have unlawfully paid rent. Reading a little bit from it, it says the suit filed last week in Common Pleas Court alleges that the property owner demanded and collected rent from its tenants for months, despite the West Oak Lane property being designated an unsafe structure by the city's Department of Licenses and Inspections. The dangerous conditions included loose and missing bricks and leaning parapet on the roof. The city, I hope I said that right. City and state law requires landlords to keep their properties safe and habitable. In Philadelphia, violators are barred from collecting rent until the property is compliant. All right, so let me say this first. I don't know this property owner, don't know the property. I don't want to speculate on what's true or not true. So let's just assume it's all true and there's real safety issues at play here. The temptation is to say, hey, the property owner isn't doing their job, maintain the property, the renter should have to pay the rent. And listen, in that scenario, even if I were a renter, I'm sure I wouldn't want to pay the rent either. But I think we need to think this through a little more. If the property owner isn't making repairs on major safety issues, the property owner is probably having some financial challenges, presumably some real cash flow issues. And again, I don't know this property, so I'm not saying that is or isn't true, but I'm just assuming that to be the case. So not paying the rent, though, does that actually help get the problem solved if there's not money to pay for it to begin with? Well, obviously not. I don't think that not paying rent is going to get those issues fixed faster. If there wasn't enough cash flow to pay for repairs when people were paying rent, there's certainly not going to be enough cash flow to pay for repairs when renters are not paying rent. So rent strikes are not going to solve the problem. In reality, it's just going to make the situation worse, obviously for the owner. But what people don't really think about is how are renters actually going to be impacted by this? I think you can make a strong case that when we have rent strikes, it actually just delays the solution that the renters actually need to see happen, which is getting these repairs done. The renters may want to see the property sold, a new owner take over, but If the rent roll is impaired, low economic occupancy, which means renters aren't paying the rent, it's going to be harder and slower to sell the property. A rent strike reduces the value of the property, and that impacts not only the current owner, but also the LP investors, the lenders, who all may have a say in what the property is sold for and may not want to take it for a loss, even if the owner needs to get out of it. And distressed sales just take a lot of time to play out. And a GP will want to avoid a distressed sale as oftentimes as long as possible, because if that does happen, they're going to have a hard time getting those LP investors to ever work with them again. So if there's a forced sale as a renter, you want that to occur as fast as possible so a new owner takes over and fixes the property. And a rent strike doesn't help that. It delays it. And so renters are going to suffer longer from it. So here's what I would propose instead of a rent strike. Since rent strikes are getting more and more popular across the country, even some cities are basically legalizing unpaid rent even for those who choose to stay put in the property. So by the way, it's not people saying, hey, I'm going to move out have a lease break with no cost because of this, which would make sense. It's, hey, I'm going to continue to live here but not pay rent. That's a whole different scenario. So here's what I propose instead. If major violations don't get resolved, you start with fines from the city. Now, if there aren't cash flow issues and the owner is just dragging his feet on this, the fines will get them moving. If there are cash flow issues, the owner can't pay the fine, then it goes to another scenario. I'd suggest some type of loan program from the city or the county or the state that comes with heavy conditions. Obviously, the money must first be used for repairs that are required. That should be obvious. And until the loan is repaid, I think the government entity could include pretty significant conditions with it. Like, for example, pretty strict eviction moratoria restrictions that otherwise would be unpalatable. And you could come up with other ideas like that to say, look, we are going to add some additional restrictions until you're able to do this, but still encourage renters to pay the rent. So not a complete eviction ban, which would be the same effect of having a rent strike, but maybe additional requirements for that to go through. And maybe even this could be a scenario you would encourage rent restrictions on a renewal until the loan is repaid as well. So again, while this is playing out, the property owner is not maintaining their end of the lease or pulling their end of the lease, then renters may be able to move out without a lease break fee. I think that'd be a much more realistic law to pass. It should be like any other business. If the company's not doing a good job, take your business elsewhere. And that empowers the renters, but also doesn't create the collateral damage of unpaid rent. It's easier for the new buyer, it's easier for the lender to assume that unit will be occupied in the future by a paying renter than to assume a current renter not paying rent will start paying the rent. Let's go back to our rental housing trivia. And we asked you today, which market does not rank in the top 10 for highest resident retention rates over the last year? I gave you 5 choices. Was it Chicago, Cleveland, Detroit, Milwaukee, or New York? And the answer was Chicago. The average retention rate of 58.4%, still above the U.S. average, but below Cleveland, Detroit, Milwaukee, and New York. And so it's a good reminder that, even though Chicago could be a larger, more vibrant market than, Cleveland or Detroit and Milwaukee. It's not just about that, right? It's those other 3 I mentioned have built very little supply over the last few decades. And so there's just fewer options in those markets. Less mobile markets tend to be higher retention. And with that, that's going to transition us to our interview for today. We'll be talking the latest in proptech buzz with Dom Beveridge. And again, what I'll really dive into with Dom is, there's a lot of buzzwords, AI and centralization. What's real, what's not, what's vaporware, what's actually moving the needle. Are we at a point of really, driving NOI improvement? I'm going to dive into all that and more with my friend Dom. So let's transition to the interview. All right, and welcome to the interview portion of today's podcast. And I am thrilled and honored to be joined by a longtime friend of mine, Dom Beveridge, the founder and principal for 20 for 20. So, Dom, good to see you again.
It's great to see you too, Jay. I'm glad we finally got to do this.
Yeah. So I'm going to tell a quick story. So I got to know you through the Rainmaker acquisition for about 5 minutes. And, I've worked with a lot of people in, various types of marketing roles over the years. And and people are helpful and they have their value, but I always struggle with, particularly in things that are, I deal with a lot of nerdy topics, a lot of data, wonky stuff. And so I feel oftentimes I'm trying to explain concepts to people, and they're rewording and I think, it's better for me to just write this myself. But what I immediately learned about you, Dom, what I've always appreciated about you is that you have a real grasp, not only on the industry, but also I think the nerdy aspects of it, whether it's the technology and the data side, and I really came to appreciate that about you very early on, and now you've continued, that depth and nuance through 20 for 20. So that's why I wanted to talk with you. So tell us about the origins of 20 for 20.
Yeah, it's interesting. I remember some of those conversations a few years ago, and I mean, the big thing is synthesis, right? It's understanding what someone's telling you. I mean, I really like the nerdy stuff, but it's understanding what someone's telling you, and then boiling it down to the sort of essence of what it's all about. That's the kind of skill that's common to what you just said, and also to this enterprise of doing this annual report. The way it got started, so this is the 7th year we've run 20 for 20. It started, so Donald Davidoff and I were going to Optech one year. We were working together, and we just had this idea of, all of these people that we want to reconnect with are being pitched technology all week this week. So why don't we do the opposite thing and say, we'd like to just ask you questions about what's on your mind, and we'll write it up as a paper or something. And we sort of did that and just found actually these answers are really interesting. And then we wrote up this paper. It had a really, really popular kind of response, and so it just became this annual thing that we did. But yeah, I think generally the idea is we interview 20 people, 10 heads of operations, 10 heads of technology. We figure out what it is that's on their mind, what they did in the previous year, what they're working on in the year ahead, and I think basically the reason it has a following is it's probably just quite a nice temperature check, on what's going on in operations and technology.
Yeah, and what's great about it too, for those of you who are listening are not familiar with 20 for 20, is that a lot of technology related content tends to be very company driven, and even when they try not to be, it's inherently salesy. And what I like about your content is that it's really more thought leadership. It's about trends. And so even if you're not a technologist, you're just somebody trying to figure out, hey, I just want to operate more efficiently, more effectively. It allows you to kind of cut through the noise a little bit. So you do a good job with it, Dom.
No, thanks. Well, and other thing I would mention, the thing I've come to learn over years of trying to figure out why people buy stuff in multifamily is context is everything, right?
Yeah.
It's an extremely fragmented industry. The companies are very different from one another. You can't understand what constitutes a good decision, or you can't even understand the parameters of a decision unless you understand what's different about the companies.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And also the noise of around, what's real versus what's aspirational, like the vaporware stuff. I mean, there's so many startups these days in proptech, not only in multifamily, but really in all types of real estate, commercial and residential. So it's tough to kind of cut through the noise.
Yeah, for sure.
So let's talk about one of the big buzzwords right now, and that's centralization. And I'm sure some people are probably tired just hearing that word centralization, especially if you're not living it day to day. But so I want to kind of cut through again some of that noise, just talk about what's real and what's not. So where is the industry today with centralization, and how does that vary by company type, from your owner operators and REITs to third party property managers, big and small?
Yeah, so it's an interesting topic, and it's one that I've been tracking through this paper and actually through other research for a number of years now. If I had to summarize this year's findings, it's like each year, what the industry at large is doing is less and less similar to what the REIT started to do a few years ago. So when I really started to look at this was around the time that like UDR and Avalon Bay in their earnings releases would be talking about their centralization accomplishments. And for me, that meant, okay, well, obviously the rest of the industry is going to do the same thing because they're getting better returns and so on. And what you realized is when you talk to people about how they're thinking about it, what they're actually doing, you realize that REITs are very different from the rest of the industry. Like the model that they have, where you have very high control over your operating environment and you tend to buy properties that are relatively close together. Those factors make this very natural fit for centralization. Like if I'm a REIT, I can think about a submarket, in terms of all of the resources that I have complete control over, and I can figure out how to use technology to optimize how what my people are doing in those properties. Very few people get to make decisions like that. Most of our industry is third party managed. What we know about third party management is that anytime you want to change anything about your operating model, you have to revisit a property management agreement that you have with ownership. The effect that has on decision making is that every decision boils down to one property at a time. So you can't do that market level thing as easily that REITs normally do. Instead, it's much more like, are we going to take this resource 100% off this one property? That's the framing of the decision that people are making. And that's a higher bar for companies to clear. So when you think about those differences, you sort of see why the whole industry isn't moving as quickly in the direction that the REITs went a few years ago. The other thing that I've really come to notice is that not only are REITs not representative of the industry overall, they're actually not that representative of owner operators, because most owner operators, their properties are JVs with different financial stakeholders who don't care about the other properties in the portfolio. So you still have that sort of one property at a time kind of dynamic for most properties in the industry, which means people are trying to figure out those problems. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, and by the way, just put some numbers behind that for people listening. Like, the REITs become sort of the face of the industry by nature being public. But I think in terms of total units, I think they're under 1 million units. They'd be a low single digit share of the market. They're a low single digit share of construction. So obviously they're important. They're leaders in many ways. But you're right, Dom. They don't always represent most of the industry. So, but so centralization, I think to your point though, could mean different things, right, to different types of companies. So. What are so as you're talking to folks though, from regardless of types of company, as they centralize, what are typically the first jobs that are being centralized, and what additional jobs do you see being centralized among, call it, the first movers?
Yeah. So I split this into 3 broad categories of work, right? So there's maintenance, there's leasing, and there's property admin, right? And when we look at each of those areas, so leasing and maintenance are self-explanatory. Property admin is usually the stuff that falls on the desk of the assistant property manager in a standard deal. It's collections, payments, deposits, move in, move out, all of that kind of stuff. And generally, there's just been this really crystal clear trend for the last few years that most of the work that is being moved offsite is property admin. So it's most of the work that's associated with the assistant property manager. Far more of that's moving far more quickly than leasing or maintenance. What's really interesting this year, though, is that you can see another way in which the trend diverges from the original sort of REIT model. So the REITs, they innovate really, really effectively, right? They do some really ambitious stuff because they can, and the REITs that sort of centralized admin basically took all of the admin work, they put it in shared services, and that meant that they could eliminate the assistant property manager role largely across their portfolios. Now, what you find with most other companies is that they are following the trend of moving their admin into shared services. That's very clear from this year's results as well. But what's different is that they're not eliminating the role. What's much more likely to happen is people kind of rebalance the roles differently in a way that's very context specific. So let's say I take all of the admin work offsite. That means I'm now going to rethink what an assistant property manager does. And if you think about all of these companies have, different configurations of portfolios in different markets. You're as likely to do something like, all right, well, the assistant property manager is now going to have more sales responsibility, or we're going to replace the assistant property manager with another leasing agent, or things like we're going to create a new role where an assistant property manager has a regional remit, so they're supported by technology, but they're going to run admin on behalf of 2,000 units rather than 300, or we're going to split the role of community manager between multiple properties because that's the most expensive role, and we're going to put more of their work on the plate of the assistant property manager. So there's all sorts of different ways that those roles are evolving. So the thing that I think is important to separate is you take the work off site, but that doesn't mean you take the role off site. It's probably more often the case that the roles at property are evolving.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Sometimes I think at a bird's eye view level, those are not involved with day to day. You're thinking about all these jobs being moved to a central office somewhere at HQ. But that's not always what's happening. Except maybe some, obviously we've seen some cases where, things like rent collections or renewals may move to like a more, digitized communication, but certainly the day-to-day stuff is not. So I was at a conference a while back, and this was executives who are not involved with day-to-day operations, but they are the ones paying the bills. And there was a guy on a panel that said, centralization is being pitched as something that's going to save us money, but it's not. We're just moving costs from one expense center to another. It's goes from staffing to technology. And I don't know if that's a perception throughout the industry, but I will tell you, there's not a lot of people in the room that really interjected and say, not true. And I don't know if it's because they agreed or they just didn't want to challenge this guy. So I just want to ask you though, where are we let me rephrase this. Are we at the point yet of centralization truly delivering cost savings, or is it more about just operating more effectively through centralization?
Well, so for the industry writ large, I don't think we're at a point where it's significantly reducing costs, increasing NOI just yet. Again, if I think about most of the industry being third-party managed, if I look at the projects where, and there's a lot of instances of this, where companies are taking admin, for example, offsite. There is obviously a headcount reduction when you make that move, but what you're finding is you do get teething problems, right? It takes some time to figure out. You've got this problem. It's not just the actual work that's being done; it's also coverage. Mm-hmm. So moving to a model where your coverage is optimal based on a smaller number of people, so 3 front office staff rather than 4 or something like that, that takes some adjustment. And what you find, because we're still very early in this process, when you talk to asset managers who've done this at their properties, they were like, okay, well, it works, but we are having to support it with more temporary staff than we probably thought we would. We'll get past that to a point where we're making the tangible savings, and the cost of the technology and the shared services is lower. It's maybe 30-40% lower or something in some cases than the direct headcount cost. But again, at the moment, I suspect in most cases that those savings are being eaten up by the contingency stuff you have to do just to make the model work as we adjust. It's interesting. I was using Avalon Bay's example that they put in one of their quarterly investor presentations, where it was their illustration of Ventura County, like their before and after picture of how they changed their staffing model. I was actually using it in a presentation to a maintenance conference. And what it clearly showed was that focusing on maintenance, you can't really change the number of maintenance techs, but they had changed the number of supervisors that they need to run that whole sort of campus of properties. Now, even if that headcount has moved over to technology, that's not necessarily a bad thing, because we know that hiring and maintaining staff in maintenance is so difficult,
Right.
that if you found any way to insulate yourself from the sort of vicissitudes of the market, then even if you've done that in a cost neutral way, that's probably a value add.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a good point. And I think also, in fairness, I think this is a little bit outside my lane, but I think a lot of things I hear from people as well is, hey, even if it's cost neutral, there's still an advantage to having key tasks being optimized to be done by people who are highly skilled in a more narrow area, more of like your assembly line approach, and have a more consistent approach. Because sometimes, the old example is always like the property manager's appeal person, and we're asking them to do back office work, right? And so when you put people who actually enjoy being in the back office versus talking to people, they're probably going to do it better and more quickly as well.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
All right, let me ask you about another topic, and I'll be very honest. Like, this is a topic that I don't like getting asked about, and because it's AI, and the reason is it's become such a buzzword that it's almost off-putting, and I think eyes start to roll as soon as you say AI. Because we've all heard the various promises of AI, especially in the industry, but even outside of it. And I think, I don't know how many people I speak for, but I feel like it's so overused and abused. Yeah. But I also have to acknowledge, obviously, there's examples where it's actually working. And so it's really hard for non-technologists sort of separate, what's real versus what's not. So as somebody who's talking to people all the time, you're into this stuff, give us, what are some examples of real, actually, not necessarily companies, but just concepts of real actual AI and multifamily, and how is it driving improvement from the old ways of doing things?
Yeah, so one conclusion that I've been edging towards is that I do think people are thinking about this slightly the wrong way. You worked in asset optimization technology before. Like you wouldn't call that like a SQL company or SQL adoption or so. The name of the actual technology that powers the thing that adds the value is not the thing that you really focus on when you're thinking about what value technology adds to the business. And when you think about AI, the thing that's adding the value is automation, right? Yeah. So it's how the AI drives automation. I think everyone gets hung up on the fact this sort of category of whether AI is in this thing or not in this thing is something that people spend too much time on. And again, there's lots of technology companies who need to get funded, and it's just this reality that if you have AI in your stuff, you're likelier to get those checks than not. And that means that there's just this slightly unhelpful conversation about like AI.
Right.
But if you think about it in terms of automation, like the sort of tasks that you can start to do at scale that you couldn't do without it, I think it starts to get more interesting.
Yeah.
So one area that I'm fascinated by right now is the idea of sentiment analysis, right? So if you think about you're a data guru, if you think about the data that's available to help us understand things like what we're allocating capital to, we spend a lot of money on upgrades, on amenities, on this kind of stuff. We don't know that much about what residents think about them, for example. Well, if you think about automating chat functions, right? So virtual leasing assistants, virtual concierges, this kind of thing, they're pretty ubiquitous in the industry right now. These things just generate phenomenal amounts of words that you can use AI to understand what people feel about the things that they're talking about, right? So if you think about, one area that really interests me right now is managed Wi-Fi, right? A big investment item, has a great return on it for investors. They're very differentiated technologies. They work in different ways, but when people underwrite the projects, they tend to ignore the differences between the products, right? The local market will bear this much of a technology charge for this technology, and I'm going to completely ignore the fact that technology A is way better than technology B. And I'm going to just view this thing as a utility. Well, you don't have to view it that way if you're talking to people all the time about their Wi-Fi. Like, you can actually get really contextual information about, do you even notice this thing? Do you value it? Would you pay more money for it? Are you likelier to renew or not? The kind of stuff that's very, very difficult to get at with surveys, you can really use AI to get inside the head of your resident and start to figure things out about about the stuff we allocate our capital to. So there's a kind of story of something that's actually tangible.
The leasing and chat stuff does seem to be a lot more real and far along. And I noticed also in your 20 for 20 report, you had a question about did any tech play a bigger role than usual in 24? You mentioned fraud prevention, and that's one where I think even if you don't know the details of this stuff, which I don't know a lot of how this stuff works. I mean, you could just intuitively know that smart technology is going to be a lot better than a leasing agent trying to detect fraud, right? So it seems like there are some areas where it's making a difference.
Yeah, well, fraud is a it's continues to be like it's the most implemented technology in the industry. It's quite a crowded market, but there are really, really cool applications out there that kind of attacking the problem in different ways. But in AI terms, it's this arms race between the bad guys AI and the good guys AI. That's the way that fraud is kind of working at the moment, since you can buy AI generated fraudulent documents for $20 on the dark web.
People don't know, even in earnest, people don't realize, because most of your multifamily and SFR executives, they're middle-aged people who are not on TikTok and Instagram on a daily basis, but these things are being openly advertised. They're out there, and you're right. It is not it's funny. I had this conversation with somebody on Twitter/X recently, and they're like, "Oh no, we can actually." It was more just eavesdropping on the conversation somebody else started. It's no, we could detect this stuff. It's pretty easy to tell what's a faked pay stub and whatnot. It's guys, this is a lot more sophisticated than what you think of old school fraud. This is highly, this is tech driven, AI innovative fraud that's happening. You got to combat that with, similar technology.
Yeah, for sure. So that's so those are some of the interesting use cases for AI. I mean, the other thing that I think might be about to get really popular is voice AI. I think that technology now is sort of good enough. There are some vendors that are doing some really, really interesting stuff in that regard. But if you sort of think about the stuff that a really convincing voice agent can do that text-based chat can't do, those are some really interesting use cases, right? So I love the idea of experiencing a self-guided tour through my AirPods. I mean, if I can chat to the agent that knows my preferences from the pre-tour conversation about stuff inside the building, that's really cool.
Yeah.
So there
that is interesting. I didn't think about that one. Well, okay, so that kind of takes us to the next topic then. So voice AI is an interesting one. Any other things you think are kind of the next big things in prop tech? And again, not specific companies necessarily, but just concepts that could be that we might see more widely adopted over these next few years.
Yeah, what's tying a couple of the things we talked about together? I actually think that. So maintenance centralization is really difficult. In multifamily, it's a really hard thing to make progress on, and most people are making very little progress on it as of right now. But one thing that I do see a lot of people trying out in 2025 that I think is a great fit is AI that addresses what we call the intake problem, right? So that handles the initial call, service call from a resident, all the way through the process of gathering information through to posting charges on the ledger, right? That kind of problem is very sort of amenable to AI, and it's a problem that you would want to have a lot of confidence in if you were a property manager, right? Because part of the benefit of this is work order avoidance, right? So if you've got an AI that's going to be telling people where to find the reset button on the GFCI plug, you want to make sure it knows what it's doing, right? So
yeah.
But the idea that I can call this number or whatever, or text this number and be told how to fix a problem that's easy to fix, or be able to ascertain whether this is urgent and needs to be fixed now, or whether it can be scheduled for tomorrow, And if I tell you my sink is blocked, it'll ask me which sink in which room. Like just all of this stuff that gives you a far better quality of data and lets you organize things way better. The other thing is when you talk to people who are trying this stuff out, you realize anytime you've got a maintenance tech talking directly to a resident, that is a great way to waste a lot of time.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, the idea that you can take some work out of the process, make a better, more immediate response, and improve the quality of data that starts enabling you to make decisions differently. I suspect this stuff is going to be really, really helpful, and I think you'll see more and more people adopting it.
Yeah, absolutely. I can only imagine how many of these, resident communications with maintenance techs get off the rails, and we're pretty quickly. All right. So, last question for you. You mentioned this is what, the 7th year of 20 for 20. Is that right? Okay. Mm-hmm. So, in this 7th year, what were obviously at this point? I mean, the industry, the people. So I'm sure there's a lot of stuff you're like, yep, I knew that. So what were the real surprises and ahas that you got from these 20 conversations this year?
Well, there are two. I'm going to give two different answers. One of them is very firmly in your wheelhouse. So looking forward to 2024, so like a year ago, the story was all about oversupply and how it was going to be really tough to maintain occupancy and hand-to-hand combat over every renewal and so on. And at the end of 2024, everybody's renewals were up.
Yeah.
And in some cases, like record level retention.
Mm-hmm.
Which I think I reached out to you just while I was doing the interviews. I was just like, this seems to be like everybody is saying this. This wasn't supposed to be the year where we had high retention rates. Right?
And sorry to interrupt real quick, but I did my kind of year in review a few months ago. I said, hey, this is probably the biggest thing I missed. I got wrong because I didn't think retention would go up like it did. So anyway, sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
Yeah, no. It's I mean, your intuition matches like everyone else's. But so the thing was, there was no prevailing narrative on why it was. So in fact, what I did, I for the paper, I just got I just fed my scripts into ChatGPT with a prompt to go find unique explanations of why retention rates are up, and it found 18 different answers to the question. So and it's everything from employer specific stuff in the local market, better service, focusing on maintenance. We're rolling out apps that make the process of renewing better. Macroeconomic stuff, cost of moving house has gone, just all these kind of things all over the map were reasons that people gave. I mean, I feel it's so consistent. It has to have something to do with interest rates, right? It must be mortgages are more expensive, and also people in starter homes can't trade out of their house because they lose their 3% rate if they do that. So I suspect just that you've got a supply and demand thing that's to do with interest rates, but it's a story of something that seems very, very multifactorial. And at the end of it, I come away thinking, I think there's some cohort of most people don't move because of any factor that you had any influence over, right? But there's always some cohort of people that do. And I guess I now think I just understand that cohort even less well than I thought I did before.
That's great.
So that was one thing. The other thing, though, is it's to do with just technology in general. There are multiple different data points within this year's responses that point to the fact that there's just like a lot of tech right now. And so, when people look back at their 2024 highlights, half of them were to do with either some specific technology or they were to do with the technology stack overall, which is unusual. Most of the time highlights are performance stuff, it's process stuff, it's people stuff, but it was very, very, very tech heavy this year. Most of people's priorities for 2025 are to do with some specific technology. And the thing that we asked that was different this year, we just asked this question about the customer journey, right? So people have been acquiring lots of bits of technology since COVID. And we're basically at this point where very few people understand what it's like to be a prospect or a resident who's being asked to go use all these different logins, all these different pieces of technology. And when you say that to people, everyone agrees with it. Like everyone bar one basically agrees that, very few companies really understand this from a customer's perspective anymore. Some companies are actively working on trying to make it better, but a lot of companies are getting funded, which is great. It's great to have lots of innovation, lots of optionality out there in the market. But at the same time, you've got a whole breed of technology companies that know to go sell directly to ownership groups, which means you if you're a third party manager, which is most of the industry. You have an increasingly incoherent set of technologies that you have to use to run properties, run processes for individual properties. It's never an asset manager's job to re-engineer their operators' customer journey, but also an operator can't really say no to an owner that wants to implement some particular technology. It's you arrive at this picture where you've got this very much double-edged sword, where there's lots of cool stuff, lots of cool options for technology out there in the industry. But I'm always brought back to that Thomas Sowell quote, aphorism, right? There are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. And the trade-off between sort of simplicity and additional functionality is one that I suspect people are not paying quite enough attention to right now.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Dom, those are great insights. I definitely appreciate your time, and I know it's got to feel good getting 20 for 20 out there. I know these kind of things take forever. It's a labor of love. So congratulations on getting that published and out and out of the draft folder. So well done.
Yeah. Well, and congratulations to you on your incredible pod stats.
No, thank you. I appreciate it. Well, Dom, thanks again for joining us, and wish you the best.
Thank you.
And that's a wrap on episode number 27. Big thanks to Dom for joining us. Thank you to all of you for spending part of your day with us. And thank you to our sponsors, Madeira Residential and JPI. We'll see you next week.